Something strange happens the first time you don't react. The narcissist says the thing that usually sends you spiraling, the passive-aggressive comment, the subtle rewrite of what actually happened, the carefully aimed dig disguised as concern. And instead of defending yourself, instead of explaining, instead of doing the emotional labor of proving your reality is real, you just look at them. Maybe you nod, maybe you say nothing at all. And in that silence, something shifts in their face that you've never seen before. A flicker, almost like a glitch. Because the script just broke, and they don't have a line for what happens next. Jung spent years mapping the psychological architecture of people who depend on others for their sense of self. He was fascinated by what he observed in patients whose entire identity was constructed outward, built from the reactions they could provoke, the admiration they could extract, the emotional responses they could control in the people closest to them. Jung recognized this as a profound failure of individuation, a psyche that never developed an internal center, and so had to borrow one from the outside world, over and over, like someone who can only see their own reflection in other people's eyes. But what caught Jung's attention most wasn't how these individuals functioned when the dynamic was working. It was what happened to them when it stopped. When the person supplying the reactions, usually an empath, usually someone who'd been trained since childhood to manage other people's emotional states, finally went quiet. Today, I'm going to walk you through what Jung discovered about the psychological unraveling that occurs inside the narcissist when the empath refuses to play their assigned role, why this unraveling follows a predictable and disturbing sequence, and what it reveals about the true nature of the dynamic you've been trapped in, possibly for years. To understand what the narcissist becomes, you first have to understand what they were. And this is where most people get it wrong. They think narcissism is about arrogance or selfishness or an inflated ego. Jung saw something different. He saw a structure, an elaborate psychological architecture built entirely around avoiding one thing: contact with the real self. The persona, which Jung described as the mask we present to the world, is something most people wear loosely. You know it's a mask. You can take it off when you're alone or with people you trust. But for the narcissist, the persona isn't something they wear. It's all there is. Beneath it, where a stable sense of self should exist, there's a void. And that void is so terrifying, so annihilating, that the narcissist's entire life becomes organized around making sure they never have to feel it. This is where the empath enters the picture, and why the pairing is so devastatingly consistent. The empath grew up learning to sense what other people needed and provide it before being asked. Their survival depended on reading the room, managing the emotional temperature, becoming whatever the environment required. They developed an almost supernatural ability to detect unspoken needs and fill them. And the narcissist, who needs a constant supply of reactions, attention, and emotional engagement to keep the void at bay, recognizes this ability immediately. They don't recognize it consciously. They just feel drawn to the empath the way someone freezing feels drawn to fire. So, a dynamic forms. The narcissist performs: charm, intensity, intermittent warmth, strategic vulnerability, and the empath responds. The empath reads, adapts, soothes, explains, forgives, tries harder. Every reaction the empath gives feeds the narcissist's constructed self. Every emotional response confirms that the persona is real, that someone is there, that the void can be kept at a distance for another day. And the empath, who was trained to believe their value comes from being needed, finds a sense of purpose in the endless work of managing the narcissist's emotional world. It looks like a relationship. It functions like a life support system. Jung would have called this a form of psychic parasitism, one person's sense of self literally dependent on the emotional output of another. And like any parasitic relationship, it can only continue as long as the host keeps providing. The moment the empath stops, everything changes. And what happens next follows a sequence so predictable that once you see it, you'll recognize every stage from your own experience. The first thing that happens when the empath stops playing along is escalation. The narcissist doesn't immediately collapse or reveal their true face. They do the opposite. They turn up the volume on whatever has always worked. If guilt was the primary tool, the guilt becomes overwhelming. If rage kept the empath in line, the rage intensifies. If playing the victim usually pulled the empath back in, the victim performance becomes more dramatic, more urgent, more impossible to ignore. This escalation isn't strategic in the way most people think. The narcissist isn't sitting in a room calculating their next move. This is a psychological emergency response. The system that keeps their constructed self intact is losing its power supply, and their psyche is scrambling to restore it using the only mechanisms it knows. Think about what this looks like in real life. You set a boundary. Maybe you said you weren't going to discuss a certain topic anymore, or you stopped responding to the texts designed to pull you into an argument. And within hours, maybe days, the narcissist escalates. Suddenly there's a crisis only you can solve. Suddenly they're devastated by something you did. Suddenly you're being accused of cruelty for the simple act of not engaging the way you used to. And if you've been in this dynamic for a long time, the escalation works. You feel the pull, the guilt. The old programming that says your job is to fix this, to soothe this, to make this better. That pull is the dynamic trying to reassert itself. The narcissist's psyche is sending out a distress signal, and your nervous system, trained for years to respond to exactly this frequency, wants to answer. But let's say you don't answer. Let's say something in you has shifted enough that the escalation doesn't land the way it used to. You feel the pull, but you don't follow it. You stay quiet. You hold your ground. You let the crisis exist without rushing in to manage it. This is where the second phase begins, and this is where most empaths get scared. Because what comes next looks like genuine suffering. The narcissist enters what Jung would have recognized as a form of ego destabilization. The constructed self, the persona that requires constant external validation to feel real, starts to wobble. And when it wobbles, the narcissist doesn't look like a manipulator anymore. They look like someone in pain. Sometimes they look like the most vulnerable, broken person you've ever seen. The tears might be real. The confusion might be genuine. The "I don't know what's happening to me" might be the most honest thing they've said in years. Because something is happening to them. The structure is failing. And this is where Jung's framework becomes essential. Because without it, you'll misread this phase completely. You'll see the narcissist's genuine distress and conclude that they're finally feeling, finally breaking through, finally ready to change. The empath in you will light up. This is what you've been waiting for. The real person underneath the performance. The wounded child you always sensed was in there. And every instinct you have will tell you to move toward them, to comfort them, to help them through this crisis. Jung would tell you to stay exactly where you are. Because what you're witnessing isn't transformation. It's the panic of a psyche that has lost its primary defense mechanism. The narcissist isn't feeling their way toward health. They're experiencing the terror of the void they've spent their entire life running from. And if you step back in now, if you provide the emotional response they're desperately seeking, you don't help them face that void. You help them avoid it again. You become the drug that prevents the withdrawal from ever completing. And the cycle restarts. Except now you've taught their psyche that escalation works. It just needs to escalate further next time. This is one of the hardest truths empaths have to face. Your compassion, in this specific dynamic, functions as an enabler. The thing that makes you extraordinary in healthy relationships, your ability to sense pain and respond to it, becomes the thing that keeps an unhealthy dynamic locked in place. Jung understood that the same quality can be a gift in one context and a wound in another. Your empathy isn't the problem. Its application in this particular dynamic is. If you still don't respond, if you hold steady through the escalation and the destabilization, the third phase begins. And this is the phase that reveals what the narcissist actually becomes when there's no empath available to maintain the performance. Jung described what happens when the persona collapses, without the ego having developed the internal resources to survive the collapse. The shadow, everything repressed, denied, hidden behind the constructed self, starts leaking through. And what leaks through is rarely pretty. The person who was charming becomes cutting. The person who performed generosity reveals a capacity for cruelty that seems to come from nowhere. The person who always positioned themselves as the reasonable one begins behaving in ways that are transparently irrational, petty, vindictive. Friends and family who only knew the performance start seeing cracks. The narcissist may begin turning other people against the empath, not through the subtle manipulation they usually employ, but through increasingly desperate, increasingly obvious attempts to control the narrative. They need someone to validate the persona that the empath is no longer validating, so they seek new audiences. Jung recognized this pattern as shadow eruption, the return of everything that was repressed in the service of maintaining the false self. And it's disorienting for everyone involved, because the person emerging looks so different from the person they thought they knew. The empath watches this and feels a strange mixture of vindication and grief. Vindication because the darkness they always sensed underneath the performance is finally visible to others. Grief because they spent years loving someone who, it turns out, may never have existed in the form they believed in. This grief deserves attention because it's the empath's real work during this period. The narcissist is going through their own process, or refusing to, which is more common, but the empath has their own reckoning to face. You have to grieve the relationship you thought you were in, which was different from the relationship that actually existed. You have to grieve the person you believed them to be, which was a performance you mistook for reality. And hardest of all, you have to face the question of why you stayed as long as you did, what it was in you that needed the dynamic to continue, what wound of your own was being served by the role you played. If that reflection is something you're sitting with right now, the slow, uncomfortable work of understanding your own patterns, you might find something useful in our guide, True Self-Discovery. It's built around 24 reflection exercises rooted in Jung's teachings, designed for exactly this kind of excavation. The kind where you're trying to find your way within after spending years oriented entirely around someone else. Click below to get True Self-Discovery. The fourth phase, and this is the one most people never talk about, is replacement. When the narcissist realizes that the empath truly isn't coming back to the old dynamic, their psyche does something that looks shocking but is entirely predictable within Jung's framework. They find a new empath, often with disturbing speed. The person who seemed destroyed by the loss of the relationship, who appeared to be in genuine psychological crisis, shows up weeks later with someone new, and the new person is receiving the same performance, the same intensity, the same charm that you once received. And they look happy, genuinely, radiantly happy. While you're still processing the devastation, they seem to have moved on effortlessly. This is the moment that breaks most empaths, because it seems to confirm their worst fear. They were replaceable. The connection they thought was unique, the intensity they believed was special, the understanding they felt existed between them, all of it appears to have been transferable to someone else without missing a beat. And the pain of that realization can be annihilating. But Jung's framework reframes this completely. The narcissist didn't replace you because you were interchangeable. They replaced you because the void didn't go away. The structure still needs a power source. The persona still requires an audience. What looked like moving on is actually the opposite. It's the frantic search for someone new to fill the role you vacated. And the speed of the replacement isn't evidence that you didn't matter. It's evidence that the narcissist cannot survive without someone in the position you occupied. The role matters. The specific person filling it matters far less to their psyche than the function that person serves. This understanding changes the entire meaning of what you witnessed. The intense early connection, what felt like being seen and known and chosen at a depth you'd never experienced before, was real in the sense that you experienced it. But it was generated by the narcissist's need for a new source, and that need creates an intensity that mimics genuine intimacy so convincingly that the empath's finely tuned emotional perception reads it as the real thing. You weren't fooled because you're stupid or gullible. You were fooled because the signal was strong enough to bypass even sophisticated emotional radar. The fifth phase is the one that decides everything, and it goes one of two directions. In rare cases, and Jung was honest about how rare, the narcissist's loss of their primary empath source coincides with some other destabilizing factor, and the accumulated crisis becomes severe enough that the persona can no longer be reconstructed. The void opens up. The shadow material becomes impossible to repress, and the narcissist enters what Jung described as a dark night of the soul, a genuine confrontation with the emptiness at the center of their constructed identity. This is where real change becomes possible, where the narcissist, stripped of their audience and their performance, has the chance to begin the terrifying work of building an actual self rather than just a convincing imitation of one. But this outcome requires something most narcissistic structures can't tolerate: staying in the pain long enough for it to become transformative. The void is existentially terrifying. The shadow material is overwhelming. The recognition of harm caused is crushing. And without extraordinary support, usually from a skilled therapist who won't be manipulated, most narcissists can't sustain that confrontation. So the much more common outcome is the fifth phase going the other direction. The narcissist finds new supply. The persona gets reconstructed. The void gets papered over with a new relationship, a new audience, a new source of reactions. And the cycle continues, with a different empath playing the same role in the same dynamic, generating the same outcome. Jung recognized this as the fundamental tragedy of the narcissistic structure. The person most in need of genuine self-confrontation is the person least equipped to survive it. The defenses exist because the psyche, at some point, usually in very early childhood, determined that the real self was unacceptable, unlovable, or dangerous to expose. The persona was built as protection, and asking the narcissist to dismantle that protection is asking them to face the original wound that made the protection necessary. That's asking someone to voluntarily re-enter the most terrifying experience of their life, with no guarantee they'll survive it psychologically. This doesn't excuse the harm they've caused. Understanding why someone became what they are doesn't erase the damage of what they've done, but it shifts your relationship to the damage. You stop personalizing it. You stop asking what you could have done differently to reach them. You begin to understand that the dynamic wasn't really about you, your specific personality, your specific love, your specific enoughness. It was about a function, a role, a position in a system that predated you and will continue after you. And that understanding, as painful as it is what finally sets the empath free. Because once you see the dynamic structurally, through Jung's lens, you stop trying to solve it from inside. You recognize that the narcissist's unraveling when you stopped playing along wasn't caused by your cruelty. It was caused by the fragility of a self that was never built on solid ground. Your withdrawal didn't create the void. It revealed the void that was always there. Here's what Jung observed about empaths who fully integrated this understanding. Something in them reorganized. The part of them that had been endlessly oriented toward managing, soothing, and sustaining someone else's psychological structure turned inward. All that perceptive energy, all that capacity to read emotional landscapes and respond to unspoken needs, all that power they'd been pouring into maintaining someone else's constructed self, it came home. They started directing it toward their own development, their own individuation, their own long-neglected inner life. And the transformation was striking. Empaths who'd been exhausted for years found reserves of energy they didn't know they had. People who'd felt psychologically drained and hollowed out started feeling substantive again, like they were filling back up from the inside. Relationships that had always felt like work started feeling nourishing. And the empath's famous sensitivity, the thing that had been weaponized against them in the narcissistic dynamic, became what it was always supposed to be: a sophisticated instrument for navigating life with depth and accuracy, rather than a chain keeping them bound to someone else's emptiness. Jung was clear about something that bears repeating. The empath doesn't heal by learning to stop feeling. They heal by learning to redirect where their feeling goes. The sensitivity stays. The perception stays. The ability to read rooms and sense what's underneath the surface. All of it remains intact. What changes is the orientation. Instead of that capacity being aimed outward at someone who can never be filled, it's aimed inward at a self that's been waiting, sometimes for decades, to be noticed. This shift takes time. It takes the kind of patient, honest self-examination that can't be rushed or performed. It takes sitting with the uncomfortable recognition that you participated in the dynamic, not because you caused it, but because something in your own psychological history made the role feel familiar, maybe even feel like home. The empath's work isn't just understanding the narcissist's structure, it's understanding their own, why the role fit, why leaving felt impossible for so long. What wound in them was being served by being needed so completely by someone so incapable of genuine reciprocity? Jung would say this is the real gift hidden inside a devastating experience. The narcissistic dynamic, for all its destruction, forces the empath into a confrontation they might have avoided otherwise. The confrontation with their own shadow. The parts of themselves that chose the dynamic, that found identity in the sacrifice, that preferred being needed to being free. These aren't comfortable things to face, but facing them is what breaks the pattern permanently, so it doesn't just repeat with a different narcissist wearing a different face. The narcissist, when the empath stops playing along, becomes exactly what they always were underneath, a fragile construction held together by external validation, incapable of sustaining itself without a constant supply of someone else's emotional energy. The performance degrades. The charm becomes transparent, the shadow surfaces, and the person the empath feared was there all along turns out to have been there all along. You didn't create their darkness by withdrawing. You just stopped providing the light that kept it hidden. And you, the empath who finally went quiet, who held steady through the escalation and the guilt and the replacement and the grief, you become something too. You become someone who chose themselves, maybe for the first time. Maybe after years of choosing everyone else. And that choice, Jung would say, is where genuine individuation begins. Where the real self, the one that's been buried under decades of service to other people's psychological emergencies, finally gets to breathe. That breathing doesn't feel triumphant at first. It feels strange and unfamiliar, like walking into a room you've owned for years but never entered. There's dust. There's emptiness that needs filling. Real filling, from the inside, slowly. But the room is yours. It's always been yours. You were just too busy maintaining someone else's house to notice. Jung believed that the most painful relationships in our lives carry the most transformative potential, if we're willing to extract the lesson rather than repeat the pattern. The narcissist taught you what happens when a self is built entirely on external validation. Let that be a mirror, not just for them, but for the parts of you that were doing something similar, building your worth on being needed, your identity on being the one who helps, your sense of self on the role you played in someone else's drama. When both of those constructions fall, the narcissist's persona and the empath's self-sacrificing identity, what's left is the raw material for two people to potentially, eventually, build something real. The narcissist almost never does the work. That's the honest truth. But the empath can, and often does. And what they build, once they stop pouring themselves into someone else's void, turns out to be the life they were always supposed to have. Quieter than the drama, less intense than the highs and lows they're used to, but solid, real, and entirely their own. If any of this is landing somewhere deep, if you're in the middle of this unraveling or looking back on it trying to make sense of what happened, the 24 reflection exercises in our guide, True Self-Discovery, were built for exactly where you are. They're grounded in Jung's teachings and designed to help you find your way back to yourself after years of being oriented around someone else. Click below to get True Self-Discovery.